Here's a list of topics that you should be familiar with from Chapter A, which was our algebra and pre-calculus review. None of these topics will be tested sort of explicitly on the final exam, but all of the skills in this chapter are sort of built into the questions that we have been working on in the calculus aspect of our course. So first, you should know and understand how to read and use interval notation to explain or to describe a range of x values. You should be able to find the domain of an expression. And we really only talked about two kinds in this class of domain. And one of them is if you have a function that has a denominator, and the bottom here can't be equal to 0. So if you're trying to find the domain of a function that has something as a fraction, the bottom just can't be 0. So you'd exclude everything from the domain that causes the denominator to be 0. We've also in this course talked about if you have a function that is an even root, so the square root or the fourth root, what's underneath the root can't be negative. So it's got to be positive, greater than 0, or it could be equal to 0. So you'd set whatever is underneath that radical to be greater than or equal to 0 and solve for x to get the domain. You should also know how to use the laws of exponents and properties of algebra to simplify algebraic expressions. So I will list them out here. If you have two things that are the same base, but they're raised to different exponents, right, you can add their exponents together. If you have the same base and you're dividing, then you can subtract their exponents. If you have something raised to a power to another power, then you multiply their exponents. If you have something like a product inside raised to an exponent, then you've got to raise everything in the product to the exponent. That also applies to dividing inside quotient raised to a power. You can kind of distribute that power there. You should also be familiar with the negative exponents. So if we say x to the negative whatever number this may be, I'll just use n, then this is the same as 1 over x to the n. And you should be fluent going back and forth between this fractional representation and the shorthand notation. You should be able to factor polynomials. Kind of the ways that we've described in this course are first and foremost a greatest common factor. Look to factor that out. Reverse FOILing, if you have a quadratic with a 1 in the front of the x squared. And if that number in front of the x squared maybe isn't a 1 and you can't take out a GCF, you could go for the AC method. In terms of factoring, the way that we use that, right, is to kind of solve a quadratic equation or some other equation that's set equal to 0. If you can't factor, so I'll put this separately here, like solving equations, right? That's mainly why we want to factor things. If not factorable and it's a quadratic, meaning second degree, you should also be able to use the quadratic formula, which is on, it's in your notes, hopefully. It's in the formula sheet that you can use. It's posted on Blackboard for the final. But if you try to factor something, and I should write here quadratic, and it's not factorable, then you don't give up. You can use the quadratic formula. In terms of other algebra stuff, you should be able to combine fractions together by getting a common denominator. You should also be able to rationalize a numerator or a denominator that involves a radical. So the way we do that is we multiply by the conjugate. And then that would, maybe you need to FOIL things out, or maybe it gets rid of a square root right away. But the idea is that the radical moves from the top to the bottom or the bottom to the top. And again, that is called rationalizing. Then in the kind of throughout the course and in an introduction in this chapter was finding economics formulas given various pieces of information. So we have talked about X always representing the number of items made or sold. Little p is the price per item for, that is set by the seller, but the consumer pays that price. Not really any formulas for X ever, but P, price, you might need to find that, and we'll discuss this in chapter 1, but finding an equation of a line using the point slope formula and finding the slope if you're given two prices at different item numbers. So this may be given to you, or you might need to build this kind of function. Then we have cost, C, which you can sometimes write as a fixed cost plus a variable cost, right, cost per one item, and then multiplied by the number of items, so times X. We also have our revenue, which is price per one item times number of items, times X. And then, of course, profit, which is revenue minus cost. Or if you want to put that all together, you can say price times X minus cost. Then you should also be able to find the break-even point. So this is where the profit is equal to 0. So once you build your profit equation, you would set that equal to 0 and solve for X, or where your revenue equals cost. Whatever makes sense to you, you can use both of these and you'll get the same value for X.